This episode, I'm joined by Kristin Girten to discuss her book, Sensitive Witnesses Feminist Materialism in the British Enlightenment, alongside discussions on Epicurean Materialism and Lucretius. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Kristin Girten, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing your recently released book, Sensitive Witnesses Feminist Materialism in the British Enlightenment, which was published by Stanford University Press this year, 2024. And this is a book that focuses on 5 overlooked figures in philosophy. Lucy Hutchinson, Margaret Cavendish, Aphra Behn, Eliza Hayward, and Charlotte Smith. And it also draws on notions such as Baconian modesty, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and I guess the foundation of the text is the place of one of the foundations of the text is the place of women in philosophy at at an era where that was I don't know how to describe it, not the thing that is done, and shall we say, to draw on the language of your own text, an immodest thing to engage with. I hope I've done an okay job at introducing your book there. But before we jump in, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and the genesis of this book.
Sure. Well, I am currently Associate Professor of English Literature at University of Nebraska, Omaha. I'm also Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activity at the university as well. My work now really focuses on research and administration. I moved here from Rutgers about 17 years ago, where I got my PhD. I'll keep it short from there, but it's been a long journey with this book. I will say the impetus for it goes all the way back to my master's many years ago now, when I fell in love with the work of Charlotte Smith. I had entered graduate work thinking I was going to be working on Virginia Woolf. And so she kind of haunts this book a bit, I have to say, in my mind, even though she's not named. But I fell in love with Charlotte Smith's poem, Beachy Head, and I've been trying to really understand it for this long. So
if you say it reaches all the way back to your master's, already going off the questions I sent you here, but if you were to say there was a thread that carried your work forward, how would you describe it?
Oh, I love that question. I have been really obsessed with trivial things, trivialities, both in terms of their significance, but also in terms of their minuteness. So I think Virginia Woolf, you can see in her work an attention to the domestic, and that really runs through her work, and how a caterpillar can mean so much in Virginia Woolf and can stimulate a whole philosophical exploration. Within the work of Charlotte Smith, especially Beachy Head, you really get that zooming in effect into the landscape. And as a lover of the sublime, I've been a lover of the sublime since I was a kid, to be honest with you. And I've always just loved vast landscapes, but encountering Woolf for the first time, it just opened up a whole new world to me to recognize I could find that sense of transport anywhere if I looked at things the right way.
Well, this notion of this kind of an irony there that actually I want to broach immediately, because it draws on the first question I have. So the introduction to your book, before sort of introducing these figures and their thoughts and their work with translation, their work in philosophy, their work in poetry. The introduction introduces this notion which comes from the Enlightenment that I wasn't too familiar with. Baconian modesty, which has these undertones of, I guess, a patriarchal notion of, the men go and do the serious, orderly. I don't know. I mean, it's so sort of old hat and Victorian. It's almost silly to say it now, right? But I think people hopefully can get the notion of what it. Well, I'll let you describe the notion, but what was interesting there about what you said was this focusing in on triviality, and then from that domestication is that from this other way that the figures in your book are looking at the world is ironically from a very they're living very domesticated lives. So their non-domesticated look comes from a place of being domesticated, which is a nice irony there.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of tension within Bacon and his movement to experience that he has to wrestle with. And that I think the authors that I work with really take advantage of, which is if you're going to move to experience as being sort of your focus for discovery, you're going to have to focus on trivialities. So Bacon and his followers, the Fellows of the Royal Society, absolutely themselves were very interested in the little things. So I have a deep love for Hooke's Micrographia, for instance, because of the way in which it does so it delves into the trivial and takes and expands its significance and as well as its size. My favorite is the pullouts where he has like the insects, the flea, the louse, and they literally jump out of the page when you're unfolding the images. But my argument is that there was a kind of discomfort as well in that what I would call intimacy that comes about between the philosopher and the material creature. And that, so in a way, what Bacon and he theorizes this through his Idols of the Mind, sort of dangers of being so close and embedded within the material world that you have to find a way to counteract that. And for Bacon, it was through this purification. He uses this concept of purification of the self. And he had faith in that. Whereas the philosophers I look at, who are all happen to be women, they dispute that possibility of purification.
Was that a conscious choice for them to all be women, or was it that the notion of sensitive witnessing, which we'll get to, came first, and then it all fell into place?
Actually, I would say there's a whole other book here that is possible, focusing on male philosophers who celebrate that intimacy with the physical world and are willing to recognize their own materiality. I've given a conference paper on John Evelyn, and I find the Evelyn tables, which are there. I would encourage your listeners to Google them and check them out. They're just visually stunning. They really demonstrate a profound recognition of the materiality of the human. And I think certain figures were much more willing to recognize their own materiality than others.
Okay. So it seems, just to sort of perhaps lay a foundation for the book, for these figures and for, I guess, the time that you're writing about, the subtitle there in the British Enlightenment, I guess there seems to be a rising split here. So on the one side, we have this, and this, I may be wrong on both of these sides, but from what you've said so far, there's this sort of an organic split appearing between a very controlled, as you said, a purification, a split between the subject and the object. Like we're over here, almost a kind of a dominant worldview from the Baconian modest side. And on the other side seems to be sensitivity, vulnerability, an openness and an acceptance of one's own materiality. So is that, from your own research, is that what you'd say this time that you're looking at, that's what it was like? There was this sort of split like that?
It's a great question. I would actually not want to own that binaristic thinking. I would say that I would point to Helen Thompson's work on corpuscularianism in the period, and a figure like Robert Boyle, who certainly, and he features in my book as well, certainly at points in his work sort of evokes this and nurtures this kind of modesty, that Baconian modesty that is tied to that notion of purification. But on the other hand, there are places where he absolutely is immersed in the matter, the stuff of his experiments. I love his work diaries because you really get to see him interacting with his specimens, and it's a profoundly embodied experimentation, and he does not deny that. So I think what the reason I was attracted to looking at these particular female philosophers, because I think they challenge the very binarism that is implicit in this notion of you're either modest or you're immodest. That is, there's nothing essential about that. In fact, they all say we're all, immersed in matter. And the notion of purification, that's a rhetorical move, perhaps it's a fantasy, perhaps it's a useful fantasy. But the truth is we're all material beings and we're all porous and open to our environments.
So I guess maybe this would possibly be sort of repetitive question, but what if it is an error? But I guess wrong right is entering into a sort of risky binarism again. But what error is that? What error do you see the Baconian modesty making in its appreciation of that very sort of subject-object split?
Well, I think there are a couple ways of thinking about that. One is precisely as you said, the sort of error of the subject-object split, to think that to recognize that, especially if we're looking at the world through an Epicurean materialist lens, as the philosophers I look at tend to do, there is no way of truly separating the subject and the object. So that's one way to think about it. But I think another sort of way to approach that question would be to think about the tension between a more transcendental view of the cosmos and a more materialist view of the cosmos. And Bacon certainly, I mean, as I point out in the book, he dabbled in Epicureanism himself, but ended up abandoning it. And that was pretty common for philosophers in the period. And I think for male philosophers especially. And I think ultimately the more transcendental kind of view of the self, of the human, ended up being more fitting for the kind of what we would call scientific practice that ends up becoming the sort of institutionalized within the Royal Society.
Could you give an encapsulation of Epicurean materialism?
Epicurean materialism is a concept that, or I would say Epicurus envisioned this concept of the cosmos as composed of bodies and void, and that all things are composed of both bodies and void, whether we're talking about our physical selves or our what we might think of as spiritual selves. Our soul too is bodies and void. And I will say, as many of us do, our sense of Epicurus very much comes through Lucretius's poeticization of Epicurean philosophy. So it's hard to talk about it without being poetic, but I will say I find it very beautiful, this notion of atoms. And so Epicurus is a foundational theorist of the atom, and he believed that atoms were always falling through space, and that would include ourselves. All the cosmos, all the atoms in the cosmos are falling through space. If you just think of matter and the cosmos in that way, it sounds very deterministic. But what I also find really interesting about Epicurus is another key concept for him is the swerve. And within that, the notion is, yes, atoms are always falling, but there's always just a little bit of chaos within the cosmos because they fall, but they swerve, and the swerve is not deterministic.
The elusive Klineman, which is completely spontaneous, and or the great fear of, I guess, of scientists. Do you think maybe such a thing as the swerve is? You said earlier that many philosophers of the day would have perhaps begun with this sort of materialism and then moved away. Do you think it is that inability to accept the swerve that is the reason of having to move away? What can you you can't really do anything with that in a scientific sense, I guess.
That's a really good point. I'll be honest, I don't do that much with the swerve as much as I love it in this book. I would say that the reason Epicureanism doesn't stick within the institutional evolution of the Royal Society is, for the most part, is because of that need for, as I mentioned before, transcendence. Mm-hmm. And Epicurus is a radical materialist. There is no transcendence within Epicurean materialism. Mm-hmm. So that's where I would go instead. I think actually the swerve for many was somewhat comforting, actually, because in an otherwise apparently deterministic material cosmos, there is the hint of a kind of freedom. And in fact, contemporary philosophers, that is 21st century philosophers now, some have linked that notion of the swerve to a kind of free will.
So, and I'm right in thinking, excuse me if I get this wrong, Lucy Hutchinson was the one who translated De Rerum Natura. So this was the first translation into English ever of De Rerum Natura?
There is a little bit of debate around that, but the general thought is that, yes, it is in fact the first English translation. And that has, honestly, that's another sort of mystery that inspired my book, because once I learned that, I was so puzzled. Why was the first translation of Lucretius by a woman? Mm-hmm. It's very surprising. You wouldn't, because, Epicureanism was not by any means fringe by the point that Hutchinson was translating. It had definitely come into England and was of great interest to philosophers within England by that time. So why was the first translator a woman? And I think my book tries to answer that because of the way in which, as I argue, Epicurean philosophy, Epicurean materialism provides women with a kind of power that they didn't have within the more conventional scientific practice that relies on modesty.
What power did it provide them?
So, as women in the period, and this is, by the way, a sense of women that persists till this day, which is the presumption that women are more closely associated with matter. Women get pregnant, right? Women, there's the notion, of course, of Mother Nature. And so that close association between women and nature, women and matter, while it can sound beautiful and the stuff of poetry, it over the centuries has been a way of preventing women from having access to certain domains. And so that certainly was the case in the late 17th and 18th century, when you get the scientific revolution and the sort of emphasis on, as I said, this Baconian modesty, this purification of the self from matter, of matter. That purification was a privilege that was really available only to men, and in fact to free men, by the way, a certain privileged man. So what Lucretius does, what Epicurean philosophy does, is say, well, in fact, there is, as I mentioned before, there is no purification. There's no possibility of becoming purified of matter as a material being. So men and women are both made up of atoms. And so, and in fact, the women that I look at in this book argue that, in fact, if you can acknowledge your materiality, you can use it to your advantage. So they turn that what is looked at very often as a handicap into a superpower.
Absolutely. So what, just out of interest, I mean, you've pointed out how quickly I am to align myself with a binary. But you say that women still to this day are seen as aligned with matter. What was it that do you think men were are by default aligned with? Ideas and like the transcendent other, platonic, whatever that other place is.
Absolutely, the mind. I've thought about Kant a few times in our discussion, and I guess now's a good time to bring him in. I think when we get to the late 18th, early 19th century, and we get this sort of Kantian sublime, we get this notion of what he referred to as the noumenal. Mm-hmm. So men being associated with that which is not phenomenal, which is out of this world, to put it in a colloquial sense, but still within the world at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, it's a complete tangent, but I do wonder if there's a possibility there to sort of own Kant in the sense of Kantian genius, right? This thing that, well, it's coming in and we don't know what it is, and no one wants to own that. I'm not a huge Kant fan these days. There's too many laws and it's too legalistic. But okay, so I'm still trying to avoid the binary, and perhaps it's I guess one question as well is, one question I have there with regards to this being the first translation of, or possibly the first translation of Durham Natura. Did it become the popular translation, or was that then? No.
Of course not. No. In fact, it wasn't published right away. So I've read it in manuscript in the British Library. I had the opportunity to do that. No, there were other English translations that came along. I tend to use Thomas Creech's translation because that became really foundational, especially for Aphra Behn, who cites Creech's translation of Lucretius. Mm-hmm. So there were a number of English translations that became quite popular. Hers was not one of them.
Mm-hmm. So how does this, I assume from the, these figures that you're talking about being women in this day, this didn't really become very much of a popular, thing that might tackle Baconian modesty. But was there much talk or writing of this sort of, I guess, reappraisal of Epicurean materialism, or was this something off to the side that was just left alone?
Epicurus runs through a lot of what we might think of, for lack of a better word, mainstream philosophy in the period, and certainly was very influential within conventional philosophical practice, but tended to be, as I mentioned with Bacon as a good example, he was inspired by Epicurean philosophy, but then ended up abandoning it. And I would say, in terms of my own methodology, I've always been very interested in sort of recovery work and notions of kind of a historical method that allows me to, and my readers, to recognize a kind of what I think of as a tunnel history. A history that you have to really look hard to see, but it's an important lineage. And as my coda to the book recognizes, especially in this current period that we're living in which there's a lot of interest by feminists in what is now called the new materialism, I think it's important to recognize that the old materialism had a value to women as well. And so that's very much a part of my book. But by no means is this to suggest that this was some sort of dominant trend. If anything, this is a very sort of hidden history that I'm excavating here. And but I think, that being said, I was just thinking as I was kind of reviewing in preparation for our discussion, I do think that where my book ends is with Frankenstein. And I do think that my book offers an important prehistory to British Romanticism. So that's a whole other topic, and I'd love to write another book that kind of goes there. But I think, we know that William Wordsworth was profoundly influenced by Charlotte Smith. And I think Charlotte Smith is very much an embodiment of what I call the sensitive witness, an embodiment that I think was very inspiring within that period. She was very well known. So she was quite influential as an author, both her poetry, but even more so her novels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you've opened the way there for a very easy segue into, you mentioned the sensitive witnessing, which is also, you also call it the sensitive method. And this arises from this discussion that we've been having. So how do you define the sensitive method?
So the sensitive method, and I do tend to, and by the way, I don't blame you for using binaries, because we live in a patriarchal culture that is founded on binaristic thinking. And so I'm going to proceed to use its opposite to define it. So as I mentioned before, Bacon set a foundation for this notion of philosophical modesty. The modest witness, as Chapin and Schaeffer refer to in their book Leviathan and the Air Pump. So the sensitive witness developed as a kind of counter to the modest witness, and whereas modesty is masculine, is premised on a kind of masculine modesty of unfeeling and separation from the objects of one's investigation. Sensitive witnessing is predicated on profound feeling and a deep sense of connection and even intimacy with both physical and emotional intimacy with one's objects of investigation.
What do you, I guess it is sort of a repeat of the question I asked earlier, but as you use the word feeling, what do you think is lost in the observation when you, I guess it would literally be in the case of modesty, repress one's feeling and emotion towards your object of investigation? What is lost? What is possibly, I guess, ruined in that when you push it away and stop being sensitive?
So I hear in your question, I want to answer your question in two ways. One as myself and one as the authors in my book. This is a historical study, so it is not a sort of argument for sensitive witnessing. However, I do say in the coda that I believe this history and the kind of sensitive witnessing that is nurtured by these authors, these philosophers, has a value to us today. So I'm going to start by answering as myself. Given that. I think we have a lot to learn from the sensitive witness of the 17th and 18th century. And that is because I think, and this is another sort of inspiration of my book, as a kind of question of how did we get where we are today? Which is, and that's me thinking as someone who's very concerned with environmental degradation and concerned with the damaging consequences of our hubris as humans over the years, and our desire to dominate nature and to use it for our benefit without a concern for the consequences of our use. And I think the value of sensitive witnessing is to recognize that it harms us to be so hubristic, that we are ourselves nature. And I mean both you and me, not just women, right? And so if we are ourselves nature, then if we're harming nature, then we're harming ourselves. And I think that is a crucial shift that I think I'm not alone in saying. This is something that we're at a crossroads regarding that at this moment. I think some people feel that we're humans. We'll always figure it out, but of course we're seeing that pain and destruction are happening due to climate change as we speak. And so we're experiencing our quote unquote environment. We're experiencing our intimacy with it today, and as we sort of face the consequences of our dominance over the centuries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why do you think we are so reluctant to admit to the fact we are nature? Are we still completely enamored by Enlightenment values? We haven't moved as far away as, well, I don't know. I guess we never really moved away from them, but maybe. But yeah, why? It's just a side question there. Why do you think we're so reluctant to admit that we are, part and parcel with the trees and the sky and everything else?
I liked watching your line of thinking evolve right there, because I have to say, I do the same thing. We are still in the Enlightenment. I think it's habit. And honestly, we've gained a lot. We've gained a lot from the Baconian modesty. We've a lot of our technological advances are because we thought big and we were arrogant. And, you look at someone like Elon Musk, who's a great sort of, embodiment of that kind of Enlightenment thinking. And so we've had a lot to gain, but now we're seeing how much we have to lose as well.
I'm not sure what to add there. I think you answered as yourself, and then you were going to answer the second part as, I think, in relation to the history of it, in relation to sensitivity.
Thanks for that opportunity. I think I would answer differently for each of the philosophers, the author philosophers in my book, but I'm going to pick one and answer as Margaret Cavendish, who, in case your listeners don't know, she was the first woman to be able to be allowed to visit the Royal Society. A meeting of the Royal Society, and it took a long time for women to be welcomed into the Royal Society, centuries. And so that was a big deal in and of itself. She happened to be very wealthy, and she happened to be married to William Cavendish, who was a fellow of the Royal Society. So it was her wealth and her husband who got her in. She loved science, and she was fascinated by her husband's practice as a fellow of the society. But she was also profoundly critical of their methods. And all of the philosophers I look at in the book, the female philosophers, they're all critical, but she was the most sort of overtly so. And so your question of what is lost in the sort of the quote unquote modesty of the philosopher, Margaret Cavendish would suggest that we are profoundly limited in our ability to understand the natural world if we want to preserve our modesty. One way that philosophers in the period would try to cultivate this modesty was using instruments like the microscope or the telescope. These instruments would allow them to have a kind of distance between themselves and the specimens. There was literally something in between them. And whereas someone like Robert Hooke would say this gives us great access to these truths within these specimens that we've never been able to see before. And there was such an enthusiasm around that. Margaret Cavendish basically portrayed these as boy toys and said, in fact, they skew your view. They don't give you access to truths. They give you access to fantasies. They may be fun, especially for you who have nothing better to do than play with your toys. But there's no truth. And certainly her argument would be there's no practical truth that comes from that kind of modest witnessing. So for her, she was very invested in, even though on the one hand, she was extremely playful. So I don't want to lose that side of Margaret Cavendish. Her nickname was Mad Madge. She was a fashionista as well. So she was quite a celebrity. But she was also very committed to a kind of practical notion of the value of scientific practice. And she felt that in being sensitive within our witnessing, that allowed us to be more practical and come up with knowledge that was useful rather than just for play.
I'm going to assume that didn't really take off as an idea.
No, but she wrote some amazing books. I mean, she was extremely prolific. But absolutely, she was definitely an outlier in the period.
Okay. Well, alongside this notion of sensitivity and sensitive witnessing, there's another idea that I want to get in from Ben, which is to be tickled. And it seems somewhat adjacent to this whole idea of sensitivity. But what is it? What is it to be tickled?
So it's ironic that we haven't. When you asked me to give a sort of brief description of Epicurean materialism, I didn't even mention pleasure. Mm-hmm. Epicurean philosophy is, of course, associated with pleasure, and pleasure is sort of the good life that is a key tenet of Epicurean materialism. And with Ben, we really get that sense of the pleasure of sensitive witnessing. Her argument is that. And I say her argument, I get at this argument through very careful and close readings of her poetry and her play, The Emperor of the Moon. Her argument is that we're always being tickled by the cosmos. And so one thing, back to your other question, one thing that is lost in being a modest witness is we lose out on pleasure. Mm-hmm. And so I argue that hers is a libertine Epicureanism. Afro-Ben is often associated with libertinism. And nevertheless, it has a serious philosophical motivation behind it. So she suggests that if we can open ourselves up to being sensitive and allowing ourselves to recognize we're always being tickled, then we're able to observe in ways and access secrets of the universe that the modest witness will simply not have access to. So it's, again, a kind of a question of access. There's greater access for someone who's willing to be sensitive.
Mm. So this form of pleasure seems to me almost more along the lines of sort of a vitalism, a vital relationship with matter, as opposed to a strictly sort of wine drinking.
Exactly.
Pleasure. Okay.
Although, we do have to recognize the sort of sexual dimensions of her writing. In fact, there's a key concept in my book that I have really been influenced by Stacey Alamo, her work on new materialism. It's the term transcorporeality, which is the notion that our bodies are always in exchange with our environments. And so I gave a conference paper once on Afro-Ben, and one of my punchlines was, to be is to swive. In other words, to live is to have sex, because in a way, there's always a sense of being penetrated by the cosmos. And that's a Epicurean notion that Ben uses to sort of think about not only philosophy, but also sexuality and their kind of interrelatedness.
I was going to add this in. I just didn't know how to phrase it. That there is a foundation of sexual fluidness beneath this whole discussion, and I guess it's almost like Baconian modesty. I mean, even the notion of being modest today seems sort of just absurd. Sort of a strange, once again entering into a complete binary, but of like a Victorian sensibility of quite literal modesty of, you know, like closing things away and hiding your ankles and all that kind of thing, and then moving through to, you know, a sensitivity and an openness that there is a correlating philosophy, a correlating science, which equally allows a new openness to come from that. But, you know, and I guess to draw in the fact that the five figures that you're drawing on are all women who are existing in a, you know, modest period, also sort of emphasizes this undercurrent of, I guess a sort of fluxing sexuality, something along those lines. I can't exactly phrase it right, but it's definitely there.
I would suggest, well, two things. One, I would just want to recognize that Aphra Behn was living in a period that was extremely sexual. So, you know, licentious, and she is a Restoration writer, but everything else, you know, certainly the other authors are writing in times that are much less so. And there was quite a backlash to the Restoration sort of explosion of sexuality. The other thing I would say is it's important to recognize that there's a distinction in the period between masculine modesty and feminine modesty. And the modesty that we've been talking about thus far has really been a masculine modesty, that notion of purifying the self, becoming mind and idea, and with Kant, the sort of noumenal. The feminine modesty, however, is something that a number of the authors that I treat in my book are actually see as compatible with sensitive witnessing. And certainly that's even with Aphra Behn, who, you know, yes, I associate her, as many do, with a kind of libertine ethos, but nevertheless, there's a kind of feminine modesty that she's still very interested in. And that comes out in her novel Orinoco, with her portrayal of Imoinda. So it's, I think some of our distinctions, and our understanding of modesty, it can be hard to sort of wrap our heads around. How can a libertine also be invested in a kind of feminine modesty? But I would say that is in fact the case with Aphra Behn. I think our notions of modesty are very much indebted to the Victorian culture, and so it does require us to kind of have a shift in order to understand certainly the Restoration period, but even someone like Eliza Haywood as well, who also is invested in a kind of feminine modesty, but nevertheless is very playful in her portrayal of sexuality.
That modesty still seems to be completely intertwined with our society, though, even though we pretend it isn't.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That is.
I think, gosh, I'm not a Victorianist, so I do think we have the Victorians to blame in a certain regard. I'm thinking about the notion of the angel in the house, for instance, and this desire to sort of, which was a Victorian concept, a desire to see women as the kind of center of morality and responsible for preserving the morality of all of society. And, you know, Queen Victoria certainly herself embodied that notion. That's quite a heavy load to carry for a woman, right? But I think our notions of female modesty do tend more in that direction. And I think that, like I said, I think it can be hard for us to really appreciate the kind of feminine modesty we see certainly in the Restoration period, but also even in the 18th century with someone like Eliza Haywood, because it's different than we would, I think, expect. And in fact, when I teach these works, students are often really surprised to see.
How is it different?
So I'm going to shift, because I've been talking a lot about Aphra Behn, shift to Eliza Haywood. Haywood portrays her speaker in her, she was the author of this periodical called The Female Spectator, which is often characterized as the first periodical written for women by women. So our modern sort of glamour magazines, this is kind of the foundation, sets the foundation for that. Haywood was also a very popular author of what is known as amatory fiction. And a lot of her writing was extremely sexual on the page. But on the other hand, there is a kind of reform that happens over the course of many of her narratives. Now, her early career is much more sort of libertine, for lack of a better word, than her later career. She's thought to get much more conservative as she matures. But nevertheless, we get this sort of portrayal of a playful sexuality. So we get that portrayal on the one hand, but then we get a sort of, like I said, a reform. So you take her novella Phantomina. In that novella, the central woman, and I read this novella because, in my book, because the central protagonist, who has many names, but Phantomina is one of them, she's portrayed as a philosopher at the beginning, but she goes on to essentially take on different roles in order to keep her love interest interested. And he thinks he's having sex with multiple women episodically, but she remains constant to her lover, just dresses up in different costumes. So we would call it kind of a fetishistic portrayal of sexuality and embodiment of sexuality. She does get pregnant at the end and is sent off to a convent. So that's what I mean by there's this kind of notion of reform and even punishment there. I would argue that Haywood is finding trying to walk this fine balance between kind of embodied experience, hence that notion of kind of the philosopher who is trying on all these costumes to see how this man reacts, which is a kind of philosophical study, but also protecting oneself from harm. And harm in this case is becoming pregnant. And so Haywood kind of wants to have her cake and eat it too. And in The Female Spectator, which is the periodical I mentioned before, her central figure is a reformed coquette. Mm-hmm. So she had lived her life, fully as what we might call through the Aphra Behn lens as a libertine, but then becomes reformed. And so, kind of like I said, has her cake and eats it too. She has the memories and the experience, but has the sort of feminine modesty of having been reformed.
Why did she become reformed? It seems like a betrayal of the Epicurean flux.
Well, so she's not Aphra Behn. So this is one significant difference between Behn and Haywood. Behn really, maintains that investment in what you called flux throughout her career, whereas Haywood, she is trying to protect women from the harm that comes from fully giving into it. So on the one hand, she recognizes we're always being penetrated, back to that. That's extremely dangerous for women. So we have to recognize how profoundly material we are, but we also have to maintain our modesty enough that we're able to prevent ourselves from harm. And so it is a kind of much more, I would say, moderate Epicureanism that she occupies by kind of investing in that kind of modesty and training for kind of modesty. But we can only get trained for that if we're able to actually recognize our profound materiality.
Do we, from any of these figures, do we see their influence filtering through to the modern day, to contemporary philosophy? Or is it just mostly in sort of small niche interests?
I think that's part of the work that I'm hoping my book will do, is to help modern philosophers recognize that there's a longer lineage than has been recognized before. So I mentioned the new materialism a few minutes ago, and while I love that movement within contemporary feminism, I think there is a lack of historical recognition of the kind of work that feminists have been doing for centuries. And so, the Enlightenment gets blamed for a lot within new materialism and within post-humanism as well. I want to argue that this kind of sensitive witnessing is a part of the Enlightenment as well. It is a sort of enlightenment perhaps, but it's coexisting with the philosophers and the practices that we tend to associate with Enlightenment history.
Are you hoping for a resurgence of Epicurean materialism or a sort of Epicurean outlook?
Absolutely. I mean, I will say, I think that, I am a 21st century human as well as being a historian. And so I am attracted to contemporary authors and scientists who are evoking a kind of sensitive practice. And I would point to someone like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a moss scientist and also a creative nonfiction writer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass. I have read both her science and her creative nonfiction, and I find it very interesting to think about and to see how she is operating as a very respected scientist, but also drawing on this kind of practice of sensitivity to her benefit and to the benefit of her work. I would also point to climate scientists today, and I do so in my coda to my book. I'm very interested in how there is kind of a new attention to the importance of feeling in science. We have to sort of, some climate scientists are recognizing we have to allow ourselves to feel and be able to not only kind of cope with our feeling, which often, ends in or results in a kind of anxiety and depression, but also to even be inspired by our feeling as we design our scientific studies. And so I think that's a kind of sort of 21st century sensitive practice that, again, I would say was sort of predicted by some of the women in my book.
Yeah. Own the existential despair of climate change.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you'd like to add about your book you feel is key that we haven't touched upon?
I do think that some listeners may be interested to think about the relationship between the kind of sensitive witnessing that I historicize and theorize, its relationship to what was called in the later 18th century sensibility, which became very much a fad in the late 18th century and had a number of critics Mary Wollstonecraft is often cited as being a critic of sensibility. My final chapter, which is on Charlotte Smith, reckons with Wollstonecraft as well. And I argue that both Smith and Wollstonecraft, in fact, were not rejecting sensibility, but were wanting a kind of sensitivity, hence the sensitive witness, that had an obligation to others and a sort of investment in the public good. And I think out of all of the authors, in terms of thinking about the value to the 21st century, I think Charlotte Smith, in connection with Wollstonecraft, as well as Wollstonecraft's daughter, Mary Shelley, I think they fit very well with kind of contemporary notions of, like I mentioned, the value of sensitive witnessing to where we are now, that if we can be sensitive, then we can invest in the public good. And so that last chapter is called A Science That Cares. And I work with the feminist notions of the ethic of care, which I believe Charlotte Smith, without having that language for it, absolutely commits to that. So I'm very interested in that chapter and thinking about what I call her ontology of kinship, and as it's connected with this ethic of care. And I think I mentioned at the beginning how I've been kind of obsessed with Charlotte Smith for many years. You see that ethic, that ontology of kinship throughout her work. She wrote for children as well as adults, in both, and my chapter treats both of various of her works. Her masterpiece, Beachy Head, was written primarily for adults, a mature audience. In that work, though, we see this sort of, like I mentioned before, an intimacy with creatures in the landscape. We see that also in her works for children, that desire to not only recognize one's material intimacy with creatures, but also our obligation to take care of them. And that is something, too, that I mentioned, that her commitment to education. I do think that that's another interest I have, is the implication of the history that my book shares, the implication for education for children today as well. I think that not only I don't only want to think about science, but I also want to think how children are taught to engage with the natural world. And I think we're still very often taught to view it at a distance and as separate from ourselves. And I think Charlotte Smith is really inspiring for offering a way to teach children and to learn ourselves how to engage with the landscape in a much more embodied way. And in fact, I'll just tell you a little anecdote in case your readers or your listeners are interested. I took my kids to the top of Beachy Head, and we sat down on literally, Beachy Head is a place in England. It's a most gorgeous landscape. And we sat at the top of the cliff, far enough away from the cliff that we weren't going to fall, but we read her poem together. And, I think that kind of parenting and that kind of teaching is really important today.
Mm-hmm. What did your children say of that experience?
They loved it. I mean, it was a sunny day, gorgeous landscape. What's not to love? Mm-hmm. We didn't read that much of the poem. We read a very kind of image-rich section where she describes, my favorite phrase is enwreathed volutes, which just feels good in the mouth. The feeling of saying that word. It's fun for kids, even if they don't know what it means. But then, of course, the cliff is full of enwreathed volutes, and we could look at them together, and that sort of natural education combined with poetry is a beautiful thing, and I think a very formative thing especially for children.
Mm-hmm. Is that where you feel your work might be taking you next? Is a book on this form of education?
Actually, My book, I think actually my next book is going to be focused on, it's going to sound like a totally different direction, but the work of Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote the first book. She's the first African American to write a book of poetry. Mm-hmm. And the kind of ecological sublime that I get to at the end of my book with Charlotte Smith, that's how I would characterize it, certainly in looking at Phyllis Wheatley. I think Phyllis Wheatley as well cultivates what I call an ecological sublime, that is a sort of material sublime as opposed to a transcendental one. So I'm interested in how Phyllis Wheatley sort of uses this material sublime, ecological sublime for her benefit as she was an enslaved person, and as a kind of sense of empowerment through that materiality. So similar themes, but a very different angle.
Wow. That sounds fascinating. Is there anything you'd like to add about Sensitive Witnesses? I'll be sure to put the links. So this is Sensitive Witnesses, Feminist Materialism in the British Enlightenment by Stanford University Press. So I'll be sure to put the links for the book in the description below. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you so much. No, this has been great.
Okay.
Really enjoyed the
conversation. Thank you very much.